What if I told you Australia, known for busy coastal cities and dense suburban life, also has towns so remote and sparsely populated that loneliness isn't a feeling, but a daily reality? In these places, isolation is structural. Populations are tiny, services are minimal, and human contact isn't guaranteed. Distance shapes every aspect of life, and solitude isn't chosen, it's unavoidable. While some residents adapt and even prefer it, the psychological impact of extreme isolation is undeniable. I'm Mr. Austral, and these are 10 Australian towns where remoteness defines existence. Australia's loneliest towns, where isolation isn't temporary but permanent. So let's start. Number 10, Tibooburra, New South Wales, corner country, extreme isolation. Tibooburra, in far northwest New South Wales, about 330 kilometres north of Broken Hill, with permanent population fluctuating between 30 and 80 depending on season and economic conditions, represents first entry where the combination of extreme remoteness, harsh desert climate, minimal services, and that corner country positioning at intersection of New South Wales, Queensland, and South Australia borders creates isolation so profound that loneliness becomes unavoidable reality even for residents who initially chose location specifically seeking solitude from overwhelming connectivity and social obligations that metropolitan life demands, incessantly creating escape that becomes prison when romantic notions of isolation collide with grinding reality of profound loneliness. The geographic isolation is extraordinary, with Tibooburra being 330 kilometres from Broken Hill, which itself is remote regional city 500 kilometres from Adelaide. Meaning, Tibooburra sits at end of very long road where casual visitors don't arrive accidentally, and supply runs require full-day commitments, travelling unsealed roads through landscape where breakdowns can be life-threatening if help doesn't arrive quickly because exposure to desert heat without water or shelter kills within hours. The population of 30 to 80 creates situation where you know everyone by name and face within days of arrival, and the lack of anonymity means privacy is minimal, because in town of 50 people, everyone knows everyone's business, creating claustrophobic social dynamics despite vast empty landscape surrounding settlement where you can drive for hours without encountering another human or any evidence that humans exist beyond occasional Bohr windmill or cattle grid. The loneliness manifests through multiple dimensions, including social isolation, where limited population means restricted conversation partners, and social interactions become repetitive cycling through same handful of people whose stories you've heard dozens of times and whose opinions you can predict before they speak. Geographic isolation, where distance from family and friends elsewhere in Australia creates separation that video calls and messaging can't fully replace because spontaneous visits are impossible, requiring multi-day journeys that most friends and family consider too difficult, creating gradual erosion of relationships through minimal contact. An existential isolation, where living in landscape so harsh and empty that human presence feels precarious and temporary, creates philosophical loneliness, contemplating your own insignificance against vast indifferent desert that will reclaim town if human effort ever ceases maintaining it against relentless environmental pressure. The history explains current isolation with Tibooburra developing as service centre for surrounding pastoral stations during late 1800s when wool industry created economic activity supporting larger population with hotels, shops, and services catering to station workers and travellers. But mechanisation of pastoral industry reducing labour requirements, improved vehicles, allowing station owners to travel to larger centres for supplies rather than relying on local merchants. And general economic decline in agricultural sector meant Tibooburra lost its purpose as regional service centre, creating population exodus, where peak population around 200 declined to current 30 to 80, with services withdrawing as customers disappeared, creating downward spiral, where service loss drives more departure, which accelerates decline. The climate intensifies loneliness with extreme summer heat, regularly exceeding 45 degrees, making outdoor activity dangerous and forcing indoor isolation in buildings with air conditioning if available, or suffering through oppressive heat if not. And the heat stress affects mood and judgment, creating psychological strain that compounds isolation because irritability and depression make remaining social relationships more difficult to maintain. The winter provides relief from heat, but brings cold desert nights, requiring heating, and that desolate feeling that comes from landscape that's brown, harsh, and visually monotonous, regardless of season, creating aesthetic deprivation that affects mental health through lack of natural beauty and colour that humans find psychologically restorative. The daily reality involves minimal human interaction, where you might see the same 5 to 10 people repeatedly through week, with occasional travellers passing through pub, providing brief novelty and fresh conversation before they continue their journey, leaving you again with permanent residents whose conversations you've exhausted months or years ago, creating yearning for new perspectives and experiences that can't be satisfied without leaving Tibooburra entirely. The internet connectivity is limited, requiring satellite when available, providing some connection to outside world through social media and streaming entertainment that creates window into world you're separated from. But the isolation from physical human contact creates longing that digital communication can't satisfy, because humans evolved over millions of years for in-person interaction, and video calls feel hollow compared to shared physical presence that our psychology craves. The services are minimal, with pub providing meals and accommodation serving as social centre, where remaining population gathers for company and conversation. General store with limited supplies requiring planning, because running out of essential items means either doing without or making emergency trip to Broken Hill, 330 kilometres away, or a police station staffed intermittently, providing security presence but unable to respond quickly to emergencies given distances involved, and basic infrastructure requiring all comprehensive needs, including medical care, shopping, entertainment, and specialised services to involve Broken Hill trips that require overnight stays because distance makes day trips impractical and exhausting. The loneliness affects different people differently, with some thriving in solitude, finding peace in minimal social obligations and freedom from urban complexity that overwhelms them, while others experience devastating isolation, leading to depression, substance issues, and eventual departure when psychological toll becomes unsustainable because humans vary in social needs, with some requiring constant contact and others preferring solitude. The turnover is constant, with new arrivals seeking Outback experience or escaping problems elsewhere, discovering that romantic notions of isolation clash with grinding reality of profound loneliness, creating departures within months, leaving only those genuinely suited to extreme isolation or those trapped by circumstances preventing relocation, including finances, health, or obligations. Number 9. Innamincka, South Australia. Cooper Creek, remote outpost. Innamincka, in far northeast South Australia, about 1,100 kilometres northeast of Adelaide on Cooper Creek, with permanent population around 10 to 15, represents South Australian extreme isolation, where the combination of desert remoteness, tiny population, flood-prone location creating periodic complete isolation when Cooper Creek flows cutting road access, and that historical significance as location where Burke and Will's expedition ended in tragedy creates atmosphere where loneliness is geographic reality and historical echo simultaneously, with landscape itself feeling haunted by failed expeditions and harsh conditions that killed explorers seeking to cross continent and claimed lives of countless others whose names aren't remembered but whose graves dot landscape as a reminder that this environment kills. The geographic isolation places Innamincka at absolute edge of accessible South Australia, with 1,100 kilometre journey from Adelaide, requiring overnight stops and traversing landscape so empty that distances between settlements measure hundreds of kilometres, creating journey where psychological impact of endless emptiness becomes oppressive as hours pass, without encountering human habitation or even signs that humans exist beyond occasional bore windmill pumping water for cattle that might not be seen for days of driving through landscape that appears identical kilometre after kilometre, creating sensory monotony that affects mental state. The sealed road ends before Innamincka, requiring final approach on unsealed tracks that become impassable when rare rains fall, or Cooper Creek floods, creating situations where Innamincka becomes completely isolated from outside world for days or weeks until waters recede and roads dry enough for vehicle passage. The population of 10 to 15 permanent residents creates ultimate small town dynamics where everyone knows everyone intimately, and privacy is impossible because in settlement of 12 people, every action is observed and discussed, creating social pressure, despite vast emptiness surrounding town, where you can walk in any direction for days without encountering another human. The loneliness comes from knowing that these same 10 people are your entire social universe, with no escape through visiting different friends or attending diverse social events, because everyone attends same events at only venue, which is pub, and social options are limited to pub, camping in surrounding desert, or solitary activities, creating repetitive social interactions that become stale over months and years as conversations repeat and perspectives calcify without fresh input. The loneliness is intensified by awareness that you're living at location where Burke and Wills died from starvation and exposure in 1861 despite being close to Cooper Creek waterholes. And despite Indigenous people surviving in same landscape for thousands of years because explorers refused help and didn't understand environment, creating historical reminder that this landscape kills humans who make mistakes or experience bad luck or simply encounter harsh conditions that exceed their preparation and resources. The historical plaques and grave markers scattered around Innamincka create constant reminders of mortality and human vulnerability in environment that remains fundamentally hostile to human habitation, despite modern technology, providing some buffer against conditions that killed explorers just over a century and a half ago. The climate is desert extreme, with summer temperatures exceeding 45 degrees, regularly creating conditions where outdoor activity is dangerous, and air conditioning becomes survival equipment rather than comfort. And the heat creates psychological stress, affecting mood and judgment, while forcing indoor isolation that compounds loneliness, because even desire to take walk or engage outdoor recreation is thwarted by conditions that make such activities potentially fatal during peak heat periods. The winter provides relief, but brings cold nights and that desolate feeling that comes from living in landscape that's brown, empty, and visually monotonous, creating aesthetic loneliness, where natural beauty is harsh rather than nurturing, and seasons bring minimal change to appearance, creating timelessness that dislocates you from normal human experience of time passing through seasonal transitions. The services barely exist, with trading posts providing limited supplies and fuel at prices elevated by transport costs to remote location. Accommodation for Cooper Creek tourists who visit for fishing and four-wheel driving, creating seasonal population influx that provides temporary social stimulation before tourists depart, leaving permanent residents again in isolation, waiting for next batch of visitors who provide brief connection to outside world. The awareness that comprehensive services require travelling to Birdsville, 180 kilometres away, or undertaking major expeditions to larger centres creates constant calculation about whether items or services are worth journey, or can be improvised, or done without creating lifestyle where deprivation becomes normalised and expectations adjust to reality of limited access. The medical isolation is extreme, with nearest hospital being Birdsville, with very basic facilities, or requiring flying doctor service for serious situations. And the awareness that medical emergency could be fatal before help arrives creates anxiety, particularly for older residents or those with chronic conditions requiring monitoring and treatment that isn't available locally, creating impossible choices between staying in place they know and leaving for locations with medical infrastructure that could extend their lives. Number 8. Birdsville, a Queensland, isolated desert service town. Birdsville in far southwest Queensland, about 1,500 kilometres west of Brisbane near South Australia, border with permanent population around 140 represents Queensland's isolated desert outpost, where the combination of extreme remoteness, requiring multi-day journeys to reach from any major city, harsh desert climate, positioning as service town for surrounding pastoral properties, and tourists travelling Birdsville track, creating transient population that provides temporary social stimulation before departing, leaving permanent residents again in isolation. And that annual Birdsville races creating brief population explosion from 140 to 7,000 before town returns to empty quietness creates unique loneliness, where social feast and famine cycle amplifies isolation during 11 months when tourists aren't flooding town, making contrast between crowded race weekend and normal emptiness particularly stark. Subscribe to show that these videos actually help and make sense. The geographic isolation places Birdsville at edge of Simpson Desert, with 1,500 kilometres separating it from Brisbane, requiring 2-day minimum journey across Outback roads, where services are hundreds of kilometres apart, creating psychological journey where civilization gradually disappears, being replaced by emptiness that becomes oppressive as hours accumulate, driving through landscape where human presence is minimal and environmental harshness is evident in dead trees, bleached bones, and that relentless flatness extending to horizon in every direction. The Birdsville track extending south to Murray is famous four-wheel drive route, but remains fundamentally hostile environment where vehicle breakdowns or medical emergencies create life-threatening situations because help is hours or days away, depending on whether satellite communication equipment is carried and whether rescue services can reach location quickly across terrain that's challenging, even for specialized vehicles. The population of 140 creates small town where everyone knows everyone but sufficient size that some social variety exists through rotating different conversation partners and attending different social events, though options remain limited to pub, sporting club, and informal gatherings at people's homes, creating social landscape far more restricted than even small regional towns that have populations in thousands rather than hundreds, providing enough variety to avoid complete social saturation. The loneliness comes from knowing that this same 140 people constitute your entire social universe, with newcomers being rare and departures being common, as people discover that romantic notions of outback life clash with grinding reality of isolation, heat, and limited opportunities, creating turnover that prevents deep friendships forming because people you connect with leave within months or years. The annual Birdsville races in September transforms town from quiet isolation to chaos, with 7,000 people arriving for horse racing and associated festivities, creating weekend where social stimulation is overwhelming after months of minimal contact. But the aftermath, when tourists depart, creates crash, where town returns to quietness that feels more isolating, by contrast with temporary vibrancy, creating psychological whiplash between extremes that some residents find destabilizing rather than refreshing. The residents develop complex relationships with races where excitement and economic benefit are appreciated, but exhaustion and disruption are resented. And the return to isolation after races creates bittersweet feelings, where relief at reclaiming quiet is tinged with awareness that months of sameness stretch ahead before next major social event breaks monotony. The climate is desert extreme, with summer temperatures exceeding 45 degrees, creating months where outdoor activity is dangerous, and indoor isolation becomes compulsory, protecting against heat that can kill within hours if caught without water or shelter, because human body can't survive prolonged exposure to temperatures that high without constant cooling and hydration. The psychological toll of being trapped indoors by heat while living in town with minimal social options creates cabin fever that urban Australians never experience, because cities offer endless entertainment and social options regardless of weather, allowing escape from indoor confinement through visiting cinemas, shopping centres, restaurants, or friends' homes that are suburbs rather than hundreds of kilometres away. The services are adequate for small population with general store, pub, bakery, fuel, police station, medical clinic, and basic infrastructure supporting permanent residents and serving tourists. But comprehensive services require travelling to Windora 200 kilometres away or undertaking major expeditions to Mount Isa or Charleville, creating lifestyle where planning is essential and spontaneity is impossible because every shopping trip or medical appointment requires logistics that urban life eliminates through proximity to comprehensive services within minutes of home. The awareness that forgetting item at supermarket means either doing without for weeks or making multi-day expedition creates mental burden of constant planning that compounds stress of isolation. The medical isolation creates anxiety, with clinic providing basic care but serious conditions requiring flying doctor service or multi-hour ambulance transport to larger centres. And the awareness that heart attack, stroke, or serious accident could be fatal before help arrives creates constant low-level stress, particularly for older residents or those with chronic conditions requiring ongoing monitoring and treatment that's difficult to access from Birdsville. The aging population faces impossible choice between staying in place they love, but which threatens their health through inadequate medical access, or relocating to larger centres where medical care is available, but where they feel disconnected from community and landscape they've known for decades, creating no-win situation where either choice involves significant loss. Number 7, Q. Western Australia, declining goldfields. Remnant Q in Western Australia's Midwest, about 650 kilometres northeast of Perth, with permanent population around 200 represents. Goldfields decline, where boom-bust history created town designed for thousands, now serving hundreds, creating physical loneliness of living in place too large for current population, where empty buildings and closed businesses testify to departed residents and lost economic activity, creating daily visual reminder of decline. And the awareness that town's best days are irretrievably past creates temporal loneliness, where you're living in civilization's ruins. Knowing decline continues rather than being reversed, creating melancholy that compounds geographic and social isolation. The population decline from peak of thousands during gold rush to current 200 creates surreal environment where infrastructure designed for much larger population sits underutilized or abandoned entirely, with empty shops, closed hotels, deteriorating houses, and that ghost town aesthetic where human absence is more present than human occupation, creating psychological weight from constantly being reminded that place is dying and your presence is just delaying inevitable complete abandonment that economic reality suggests is coming eventually. The loneliness comes from knowing that every year population decreases slightly as older residents die and aren't replaced by younger arrivals. And that trajectory suggests Q will eventually cease existing as viable settlement, becoming complete ghost town, where buildings slowly collapse and desert reclaims land that humans briefly occupied before economic forces moved on. The geographic isolation places Q 650 kilometres from Perth, requiring 7 to 8 hour drive, creating separation from capital city that makes casual visits impossible and requires major commitment to travel, isolating residents from family and friends who live in Perth or other population centres, creating gradual estrangement as relationships fade through minimal contact. The surrounding goldfields landscape, while historically significant and possessing harsh beauty, is fundamentally hostile to human habitation, with extreme heat, minimal water, and that emptiness, where nearest neighbours might be dozens of kilometres away on isolated mining leases, creating geographic isolation, compounding social isolation from minimal town population, creating layered loneliness that reinforces itself. The climate is goldfields extreme, with summer temperatures regularly exceeding 45 degrees, creating months where outdoor activity is dangerous, and air conditioning becomes essential for survival rather than comfort. And the heat creates psychological stress that affects mood and judgment, while forcing indoor isolation that compounds loneliness. Because even desire to escape confines of home through walking or outdoor recreation is thwarted by conditions making such activities potentially fatal during peak periods. The winter provides relief, but brings cold nights, and that aesthetic desolation of Goldfields landscape that's brown, rocky, and sparse, creating visual monotony that affects mental health through lack of natural beauty and seasonal change that provides psychological markers of time passing. The services are minimal for population of 200 with general store, pub, post office, and basic infrastructure, barely maintaining viability as customer base continues shrinking. And the awareness that each business closure reduces town viability, creating pressure on remaining businesses to absorb customers from closed competitors or close themselves, creating downward spiral, where service withdrawal accelerates population decline, which drives further service withdrawal in feedback loop that seems impossible to break. The medical services are basic, with clinic providing limited primary care, but comprehensive medical needs requiring travel to Meekatharra 130 kilometres away, or major centres creating healthcare isolation, particularly concerning for ageing population that characterises declining towns where younger people leave and older people remain until health deterioration forces relocation. Number 6. Pooncarie, New South Wales. Darling River, abandoned settlement. Pooncarie in far west, New South Wales, on Darling River, about 160 kilometres south of Broken Hill, with permanent population around 60, represents absolute decline, where environmental degradation, economic collapse, and geographic isolation created conditions so bleak that population decreased from several hundred to current 60, creating ghost town atmosphere, where loneliness comes from living in place that's visibly dying, with empty houses, closed businesses, and general abandonment, creating physical manifestation of isolation, and the awareness that staying means accepting you're among last residents of settlement that will probably cease existing within decades, creates existential loneliness, contemplating mortality of town mirroring human mortality. The population of 60 creates ultimate small town isolation, where everyone knows everyone intimately, and privacy is impossible. But the loneliness comes from knowing that this same 60 people are your entire social universe, with no growth or change, because Pooncarie attracts virtually no newcomers, meaning social landscape is static, with same conversations recurring and same social events repeating, creating stagnation that urban Australians never experience, because cities constantly provide fresh encounters and new people, even for introverts who make minimal effort seeking social contact, finding novelty through random encounters at shops, public transport, or workplaces. The geographic isolation places Pooncarie 160 kilometres from Broken Hill across empty landscape, where distances between settlements measure dozens of kilometres, creating journey that feels longer than distance suggests, because monotony of empty scrubland creates psychological effect where time stretches, and isolation becomes oppressive with nothing to see or engage attention during drive. The Darling River location historically provided economic activity through paddle steamer transport and irrigation agriculture, creating prosperous settlement. But river degradation from upstream water extraction and environmental mismanagement means Darling frequently doesn't flow, becoming stagnant pools or completely dry, eliminating recreational benefits and creating visual reminder of environmental collapse affecting entire Murray-Darling system. The climate is harsh inland, with extreme summer heat exceeding 40 degrees, regularly creating months where outdoor activity is limited to mornings and evenings. And the heat stress affects mood, creating psychological burden that compounds isolation. The landscape, while possessing harsh beauty during rare periods when Darling flows and vegetation greens, is typically brown, dry, and desolate, creating visual monotony affecting mental health through lack of aesthetic stimulation and seasonal change, providing psychological markers. The services barely exist, with general store, if operating, pub, with uncertain hours, depending on whether staff and customers exist, and minimal infrastructure requiring all comprehensive needs to involve Broken Hill trips 160 kilometres away, creating lifestyle where every purchase or service requires major commitment and planning that urban life eliminates through proximity to comprehensive services within minutes of home. The loneliness is intensified by visible decay, where empty houses with caving roofs and broken windows, closed businesses with faded signs and boarded doors, and general atmosphere of abandonment creates physical manifestation of isolation, making you constantly aware that you're living in a place that's dying, and your presence is just temporarily delaying inevitable complete abandonment. The temporal loneliness of living in place whose best days are irretrievably past and whose future involves continued decline until complete abandonment creates melancholy that compounds geographic and social isolation, creating psychological burden. Number 5. Winton, Queensland. Dinosaur country, remote outback. Winton in central Queensland, about 1,100 kilometres west of Brisbane, with permanent population around 900, represents Queensland outback isolation, where the combination of extreme remoteness requiring multi-day journeys from any major city, positioning in landscape so empty and harsh that nearest towns are hundreds of kilometres away, climate extremes creating months where outdoor activity is dangerous, an economic base dependent on declining pastoral industry and modest dinosaur tourism creates conditions where loneliness comes not from minimal population like smaller entries, but from profound geographic isolation, creating separation from broader Australian society and awareness that you're living at absolute edge of viable human habitation. The geographic isolation places Winton 1,100 kilometres from Brisbane and 600 kilometres from Townsville, requiring full-day drives, minimum across outback roads, where services are sparse, and breakdowns can create dangerous situations because help is hours away. The journey to Winton creates psychological impact, where hours of empty landscape gradually induce feeling of separation from civilization, with distances between settlements measuring hundreds of kilometres, creating awareness that you're travelling into region where human presence is minimal, and environmental conditions are harsh enough that survival without modern technology would be impossible. The population of 900 creates small town where social options exist through sufficient residents providing variety in conversation partners and social events. But the geographic isolation from rest of Australia creates different loneliness than minimal population. It's isolation from broader society, where you're separated from family and friends elsewhere, where cultural events and entertainment require travelling hundreds of kilometres, where spontaneous visits from people outside Winton are impossible, requiring planned visits that most friends and family consider too difficult, creating gradual social isolation as relationships with people elsewhere fade through distance and minimal contact until you realise that your world has contracted to this small town and people beyond have become strangers. The loneliness manifests through cultural isolation, where Winton residents are separated from mainstream Australian culture, experiencing news and trends through television and internet, but unable to participate directly in cultural life that occurs in cities, creating feeling of being spectator to society rather than participant watching world continue without you. The isolation from specialised services, including medical specialists, education options, and professional services, creates practical isolation, where addressing needs requires travelling hundreds of kilometres, creating lifestyle where deprivation and doing without become normalised, because accessing what urban Australians consider basic services requires major commitment. Number 4. Thargomindah, or Queensland Outback Service Centre, Isolation, Thargomindah, in southwest Queensland, about 1,000 kilometres west of Brisbane, with permanent population around 250, represents Queensland Outback Service Centre Isolation, where the positioning as administrative centre for vast region creates town slightly larger than most outback settlements. But geographic isolation remains profound, with nearest substantial centres being hundreds of kilometres away, creating conditions where loneliness comes from being separated from broader Australian society, living in landscape so remote and harsh that urban Australians can barely conceptualise distances and conditions involved in Thargomindah existence. The geographic isolation places Thargomindah 1,000 kilometres from Brisbane across outback roads, requiring full-day drive, minimum with nearest substantial centre being Cunnamulla, 200 kilometres away, creating separation from services and social opportunities that distance renders inaccessible for casual access. The journey to Thargomindah creates psychological journey, where urban landscape gradually transitions to outback emptiness, with hours of driving through landscape where settlements are sparse and environmental harshness becomes increasingly evident. The population of 250 creates small town where social landscape provides more variety than tiny outposts, but remains fundamentally limited, with same people encountered repeatedly through weeks and months, creating social saturation, where conversations become repetitive and novelty disappears. The loneliness comes from knowing that significant relationships and social stimulation require travelling hundreds of kilometres, creating separation from family and friends who live elsewhere. Number 3. Menzies. Western Australia, Goldfields Ghost Town. Living Menzies in Western Australia's Goldfields, about 130 kilometres north of Kalgoorlie, with permanent population. Around 150 represents Goldfields. Ghost town isolation, where boom-bust history created town designed for thousands, now serving hundreds. Creating physical loneliness from living in oversized settlement where empty buildings outnumber occupied ones. And the harsh Goldfields climate, extreme isolation even by Goldfield standards, and awareness that town's prosperity is irretrievably past, creates multi-layered loneliness, combining geographic isolation, social isolation from minimal population, and temporal isolation from living in civilization's ruins. The population of 150 creates town where everyone knows everyone intimately, and social landscape is fundamentally limited with same people, encountered repeatedly, creating social saturation, and that particular loneliness where you have people around but crave novelty and fresh perspectives that can only come from encountering new people, which geographic isolation makes virtually impossible. The turnover is minimal because Menzies attracts almost no newcomers, meaning social landscape is static. The climate is Goldfields extreme, with summer temperatures regularly exceeding 45 degrees, creating months where outdoor activity is life-threatening and air conditioning becomes essential for survival rather than comfort. The Goldfields landscape, while possessing harsh beauty with red earth and sparse vegetation, is fundamentally monotonous, creating visual environment lacking seasonal change or natural beauty. Number 2. Wittenoom, Western Australia, abandoned asbestos town. Final residence. Wittenoom, in Western Australia's Pilbara, represents unique and extreme isolation, where government efforts to completely depopulate town due to asbestos contamination have reduced population from historical thousands to current 3 to 6 permanent residents who refuse evacuation, creating situation where loneliness is absolute, with literally handful of people remaining in town. That government has removed from maps, disconnected services from, and actively discourages visiting, creating isolation more profound than any other Australian location, because Wittenoom isn't just remote or small, but actively being erased from existence. The population of 3 to 6 creates ultimate isolation, where your entire social universe consists of literally countable individuals, and social interactions are limited to same handful of people you see, repeatedly creating social landscape so restricted that loneliness becomes existential reality rather than temporary state. The loneliness is intensified by awareness that outside world considers Wittenoom uninhabitable, actively working to eliminate town completely, meaning that staying represents defiance, but also acceptance that you're choosing isolation so extreme that even other isolated outback towns seem vibrant. The climate is Pilbara extreme, with summer temperatures regularly exceeding 45 degrees, creating months where surface temperatures make outdoor activity potentially fatal, and underground, dugout living becomes necessity rather than choice. The asbestos contamination creates additional isolation through health anxiety, where every breath potentially contains fibers that will cause cancer decades later. Number 1. Nullarbor roadhouses. Ultimate isolation between civilizations. At number 1, the Nullarbor Plain roadhouses, including locations like Nullarbor, Eucla, Mundrabilla, and Madura, represent ultimate Australian isolation, not because of minimal population, which several entries have, or extreme remoteness, which others share, but because of unique positioning in vast empty landscape between South Australia and Western Australia, where nearest towns in any direction are hundreds of kilometres away across featureless plain, creating isolation so profound that loneliness becomes defining characteristic of existence, where your entire social universe consists of perhaps 5 to 10 roadhouse workers and occasional travellers passing through who provide brief social contact before departing, leaving you again in profound isolation, surrounded by emptiness, extending to horizon in all directions, without single feature to break visual monotony. The geographic isolation is absolute, with Nullarbor Plain extending over 1,000 kilometres between Tadjoura in South Australia and Norseman in Western Australia, with roadhouses positioned every 100 to 200 kilometres along route, creating service points in otherwise completely empty landscape where nothing exists between roadhouses except flat treeless plain. The population at each roadhouse typically consists of 5 to 10 workers living in demountables or converted shipping containers, creating micro-community where everyone knows everyone intimately and privacy is impossible. But the loneliness comes from knowing that this same 5 to 10 people are your entire social universe for months at time, with only brief interruptions from travellers who provide temporary novelty before departing, leaving you again with co-workers whose conversations and personalities you've exhausted. The climate means hot, dry summers with temperatures regularly exceeding 35 to 40 degrees, and cool winters with cold nights creating temperature extremes. But more significantly, the landscape is featureless, plain extending to horizon, creating visual monotony that affects mental health through complete lack of natural beauty or visual stimulation, with nothing to see except flat, empty scrubland, creating aesthetic isolation that compounds social isolation through environment offering nothing to engage attention or provide psychological restoration. The psychological toll is severe, with roadhouse work being characterized by high turnover, where people arrive seeking adventure or high wages, but discover that isolation creates depression, cabin fever, and psychological strain that becomes unsustainable within months leading to departure. The workers who stay long-term have developed coping mechanisms, including embracing solitude, finding meaning in simplicity, maintaining connection to outside world through technology, and accepting that loneliness is price paid for wages and lifestyle that offers escape from urban complexity. Support the channel by subscribing, because content documenting Australia's loneliest towns beats romantic notions of isolation while showing that profound loneliness from extreme remoteness and minimal human contact creates psychological challenges that urban existence never forces confronting. And there you have it, 10 Australian towns where combinations of extreme geographic isolation, minimal populations, harsh climates, and economic decline create conditions where loneliness becomes structural reality rather than temporary emotional state. Proving that while solitude can be chosen and healthy, the profound isolation that characterises Australia's remotest locations creates psychological challenges that most Australians cannot comprehend from urban or coastal perspectives, where human contact is constant and services are comprehensive.